Here's something nobody talks about when they describe people who've quietly built serious wealth. They don't look the way you'd expect. They're not the ones loudest about investing. They're not tracking every market movement or optimizing every dollar with visible effort. They're not disciplined in any heroic sense of the word. What the research actually shows is something far less dramatic and far more useful. Behavioral economists at the University of Chicago Booth School found that the strongest predictors of long-term wealth accumulation aren't income level, financial knowledge, or willpower. They're specific behavioral patterns. Automated ones. The kind that run quietly in the background while the person living them is doing something else entirely. Here's the thing. We've been sold a story about money that puts character at the center. The story goes that people who save are simply more disciplined, more responsible, more future-oriented than people who don't. And if you struggle with money, the implication is that something in your character is the problem. That story is not only wrong, it's actively getting in your way. Your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, long-term thinking, and impulse regulation, runs on a finite daily reserve. Every financial decision you make, however minor, draws from that reserve. By the time most people encounter their biggest spending temptations, the tank is already running low. The people who build $100,000 and then $200,000 and then more aren't winning a willpower contest. They've built a set of defaults so boring, so automatic, so completely beneath conscious notice that wealth compounds in the background while they're living their lives. Stay with me because what follows isn't a list of things to try harder at. It's an explanation of why your brain builds wealth or quietly leaks it, and why the habits that actually work are the ones nobody ever brags about. The first habit sounds almost too simple to take seriously. It's automating your savings so thoroughly that you genuinely forget the money exists. Here's the thing, and this is the one most people have completely backwards. Most people think the key to saving is remembering to save, staying motivated, keeping the goal visible. But research from Stanford on financial automation found that people who set up automatic transfers to savings reported equivalent life satisfaction to people who earned meaningfully more but saved manually. The number in their bank account was smaller. Their quality of life was indistinguishable. The mechanism behind this connects to a well-documented concept in behavioral economics called mental accounting. The tendency for your brain to categorize money based on where it physically lives. Money sitting in your checking account is mentally tagged as available. Your brain factors it into spending calculations, registers it as a resource to be allocated, and generates low-grade pressure to use it. Money that never lands there in the first place isn't grieved. It isn't craved. It simply doesn't exist in your brain's budgeting model. Your nervous system adapts to the smaller number without protest. What this feels like from the inside is almost disconcertingly undramatic. People who've done this for years describe the savings as happening to someone else. There's no daily resistance to overcome because there's no daily decision to make. The wealth builds the way a plant grows, not through effort, but through conditions. The hidden cost worth naming. Out of sight can drift into out of mind in ways that occasionally backfire. If you've automated savings but never checked the account, you can lose the motivating feedback of watching it grow, and that visibility is its own psychological fuel. The reframe is simple. Schedule one brief monthly check-in, not to adjust anything, just to see. That small window of awareness keeps the habit emotionally rewarding without requiring daily willpower. The second habit is keeping your financial life almost insultingly simple. Research from Columbia University on decision architecture found that when people are presented with more options, even objectively better ones, they make worse decisions and report lower satisfaction with outcomes. This is called choice overload, and it maps directly onto personal finance in ways that most people never connect. Every financial product, account type, investment platform, and subscription service you add to your life is another object your prefrontal cortex has to track, evaluate, and occasionally decide about. The cognitive overhead accumulates in the background, quietly, without announcing itself. People with overcomplicated financial lives aren't managing their money better. They're just managing more. And managing more creates more surface area for inertia, avoidance, and the kind of quiet leakage that never shows up as a single line item but hollows out a budget across a year. People who've simplified describe a specific kind of financial calm that has nothing to do with their net worth. They don't dread opening their banking app. They're not avoiding a pile of statements. There's a low-grade relief in knowing exactly where everything is and exactly what it's doing. The trade-off is real and worth acknowledging directly. Oversimplification can mean leaving genuine optimization on the table. A person who refuses to open a higher yield account because the process feels like too many steps is paying for their simplicity in foregone returns. The distinction that matters: simplify the number of decisions, not the quality of them. One well-chosen account beats 3 mediocre ones you never think about. The third habit is one that sounds, on the surface, like negligence. It's never checking your investments during periods of market turbulence, but here's what nobody tells you about the people who build the most wealth over time. Research from Dalbar, a financial research firm that has tracked investor behavior across decades, consistently finds that the average equity investor significantly underperforms the very index funds they're invested in. Not because they chose bad funds, because of the timing of their own decisions, the buying and selling they did in response to what they were watching. This connects to one of the most replicated findings in behavioral economics: loss aversion, documented extensively across decades of research. The psychological pain of watching a portfolio decline is neurologically processed as roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. That asymmetry means every time you open a falling account, your brain isn't receiving information. It's triggering a threat response, and threat responses produce one instinct with remarkable consistency: do something, get out, protect what's left. In markets, doing something during a downturn is almost always the expensive move. What not checking feels like from the inside is worth being honest about. It feels irresponsible. Your brain interprets inaction as negligence, especially when numbers are moving. There's a specific anxious pull toward opening the app, a feeling that something needs to be managed, that you're failing some duty of attention. Sitting with that pull and not acting on it is one of the most counterintuitive wealth-building behaviors that exists. The practical reframe: replace reactive checking with scheduled reviews, quarterly or biannually. The goal isn't ignorance, it's insulation from your own nervous system at its most reactive. The fourth habit runs directly against the advice you've probably been given. It's having one spending category that is fully guilt-free and completely protected, and treating that protection as non-negotiable. Here's something fascinating. Research from the University of California, Berkeley on self-regulation found that people who allow themselves designated guilt-free spending are significantly more likely to maintain broader financial discipline over time than people who attempt total restriction. The mechanism is called ego depletion, the idea that self-control draws from a shared cognitive resource, and that the experience of feeling constantly denied depletes that resource over time. It's worth noting that ego depletion research has faced some replication challenges in recent years, and the field continues to refine its understanding of the mechanism. But the directional finding that flexible restriction outperforms rigid restriction for long-term adherence is supported across multiple independent lines of research. When your brain perceives every discretionary purchase as a small moral failure, it doesn't quietly become more disciplined. It becomes more brittle. Rigid financial systems tend to produce what psychologists call the what the hell effect. One perceived slip triggers a full abandonment of the system. You overspend once, the internal story shifts to "I've already blown it," and the discipline collapses entirely. A protected spending category preempts that collapse. Your brain knows relief is available, which makes the constraint around everything else feel survivable rather than suffocating. People who do this well describe genuine confusion about it, like they're getting away with something. They're spending freely in one area and building wealth everywhere else simultaneously, and the two facts feel contradictory until you understand that the permitted category is precisely what makes the rest of the architecture hold. The hidden cost. The guilt-free category can become a justification for scope creep if it isn't clearly bounded. I allow myself experiences is psychologically different from I allow myself up to a defined amount per month on experiences. The clarity of the boundary is what gives the permission its stabilizing power. The fifth habit is one that almost nobody frames as a money habit. It's making financial decisions in the morning and almost never at night. The psychology behind this one is this. Your prefrontal cortex runs on a finite daily budget, and that budget is directional. It depletes across the day as decisions accumulate. A widely cited study of judicial parole decisions published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that favorable rulings were highest in the morning and declined toward near zero by late afternoon, recovering only briefly after breaks. The judges weren't becoming less fair. They were becoming more cognitively depleted, and depletion produces a systematic bias toward the path of least resistance. This is decision fatigue, the progressive deterioration of decision quality as the brain's executive resources are drawn down. In financial terms, what this means is precise. By evening, after hours of work decisions, social navigation, and minor friction, your capacity for the kind of long-term reasoning that produces good financial choices is significantly reduced. Evening is when subscriptions don't get canceled, when expensive shortcuts feel justified, when "I'll deal with it tomorrow" becomes the default on everything uncomfortable. Not because you lack commitment to your financial goals, because your brain is running on a depleted reserve and defaulting to whatever requires the least from it. Most people know this instinctively without naming it. They notice that big financial commitments made at night feel different in the morning, heavier, less certain, occasionally regrettable. That feeling is information. It's your well-rested prefrontal cortex reassessing a decision your depleted one made. The practical shift is nearly effortless once you recognize the mechanism. Block 10 minutes in the morning, before the day's decisions begin accumulating, for any financial task that requires real judgment. Transfers, cancellations, contract reviews, large purchases. Not because you'll be smarter, because you'll be less depleted. That difference closes more financial leakage than most people realize. The sixth habit is one that sounds like a personality trait more than a strategy. It's letting yourself feel genuinely bored rather than filling empty time with spending. Here's the thing. Boredom has a financial cost that almost nobody calculates. Research from the University of Virginia found that people will go to significant lengths to avoid unstructured mental downtime, including, in one study, administering mild electric shocks to themselves rather than sitting quietly with their thoughts. That finding has been widely replicated and points to something important about how modern brains relate to idle time. A separate line of consumer behavior research found that browsing without any purchase intent activates the same reward circuitry as actually buying, effectively training your brain to associate idle time with the relief of consumption. Your brain doesn't experience boredom neutrally. For most people, idle moments have been reconditioned through years of frictionless scrolling and one-click purchasing to trigger a specific behavioral sequence. Open something, browse something, add something to a cart. The brain has learned that boredom ends with consumption, which means every unoccupied moment is one thumb movement away from a purchase that wasn't planned, wasn't wanted in any lasting sense, and won't produce satisfaction beyond the transaction itself. What it feels like to interrupt that sequence is worth describing honestly. It's uncomfortable. There's a low-grade restlessness that the brain reads as a problem requiring a solution. People who've built this habit describe a period of weeks where something felt missing, a kind of ambient wanting that had been running so constantly they hadn't noticed it until it started quieting down. And then it shifted. The discomfort faded. What replaced it wasn't emptiness. It was a reduction in the constant low-level pressure to acquire. The trade-off deserves acknowledgement. Genuine leisure without stimulation is an acquired skill in an environment engineered to prevent it. Be patient with the discomfort. The brain adjusts. And the spending that evaporates when you stop filling time with consumption tends to be the spending you'd struggle to account for if someone asked where your money went. The seventh habit is one of those recommendations that sounds like generic advice until you understand the neuroscience underneath it. It's delaying any non-urgent purchase by exactly 72 hours. But here's what nobody talks about when they hand you this advice. The reason it works isn't willpower, it's neurochemistry. Research on effective forecasting, the brain's ability to predict its own future emotional states, across studies from Harvard and the University of Virginia found that people consistently overestimate how much pleasure a purchase will bring and how long that pleasure will last. The technical term is the impact bias, your brain's systematic tendency to exaggerate the emotional intensity of future events, positive or negative. When you encounter something you want to buy, your brain doesn't dispassionately evaluate the item. It releases a small surge of dopamine, not from owning the thing, but from anticipating owning it. That anticipatory signal is what registers as urgency, as need, as the feeling that you should act now before the opportunity passes. The 72-hour rule doesn't test your discipline, it waits for that dopamine to metabolize. The desire that felt urgent on Tuesday frequently doesn't survive to Friday, not because the item changed, not because you thought about it rationally and decided against it, but because the neurochemical event that produced the desire ran its natural course and resolved on its own. People who practice this reliably describe a specific experience of returning to an item 3 days later and finding it almost unrecognizable, wondering what exactly had felt so pressing about it. The wanting had been so real in the moment. And then it simply wasn't there anymore. The honest trade-off, occasionally you'll miss a genuine deal that expired. Your brain will remember that miss with remarkable vividness and use it as evidence against the habit. Run the numbers across a full year of avoided impulse purchases, though, and the math resolves clearly in favor of the delay. The eighth habit is tracking your spending without any goal or judgment attached to it. Here's where it gets interesting. Because the tracking itself is the mechanism, not the spreadsheet, not the budget, not the plan that follows from it. Research from the University of Cambridge on financial behavior found that people who track their spending, without any attached pressure to change it, naturally reduce their expenditure by an average of 15% within 3 months. Not because they were trying. Because awareness changes behavior through a process behavioral economists call the observation effect, the same mechanism that causes people to perform differently when they know they're being observed. When you track a behavior, you become the observer of your own patterns. And the part of your brain responsible for self-concept begins, quietly and without being asked, to update. What the first week of this habit actually feels like is both revealing and uncomfortable in equal measure. Not because the numbers are alarming, though sometimes they are, but because the patterns suddenly become legible. The way spending spikes after difficult conversations, the purchases that cluster around certain times of day, the subscriptions running in the background on services used once and forgotten. None of it was secret. It simply wasn't visible until it was written down. You're not broken if what you see surprises you. You're not undisciplined. You're just encountering data about your own behavior that you didn't previously have access to. The hidden cost worth naming directly, visibility without self-compassion becomes shame. And shame in financial context produces one reliable behavioral outcome: avoidance. The person who opens their tracking app, sees a number that embarrasses them, and closes it forever has not built a habit. They've built a barrier. Track as a scientist, not a judge. The data is information. What you do with it is a separate question that can wait until the tracking itself is stable. The ninth habit is one that creates social friction that's worth naming honestly. It's keeping your financial wins completely private. The psychology of this one is this. Research from New York University found that sharing a goal, telling others about a financial intention or milestone, produces a premature sense of completion. The social recognition of the stated goal partially satisfies the same psychological need that achieving the goal would meet, reducing the internal drive to follow through. The acknowledgement from others substitutes for the reward your brain was using as motivation. You announce the milestone, receive the response, and the engine that was pushing you toward the next one quietly loses pressure. There's a parallel finding in consumer research. Visible, social spending, purchases made to signal status or broadcast on social platforms, produces shorter-lived satisfaction than private spending aligned with personal values. The external validation degrades the internal experience. Your brain processes the approval of others and then, fairly quickly, needs more of it to maintain the same level of satisfaction. It's a loop with diminishing returns. People who've internalized this habit describe a specific internal steadiness that has nothing to do with isolation. They know what they're building. They've learned, over time, that knowing is enough. The satisfaction doesn't require an audience to be real. The trade-off deserves honest acknowledgement, genuine accountability to another person, and real community around financial goals. Help some people significantly. The distinction worth holding is between sharing progress with a trusted person for the purpose of accountability versus broadcasting milestones for the purpose of social validation. One sustains the behavior, the other partially substitutes for it. And here's what nobody tells you about this last habit. It isn't really a tactic. It's the psychological foundation that makes everything else on this list sustainable over years rather than weeks. The 10th habit is accepting, at something deeper than the intellectual level, that your financial life is going to look boring from the outside and becoming genuinely at ease with that. Research on hedonic adaptation, extensively documented by psychologists including Sonia Lyubomirsky at the University of California, Riverside, found that people return to a relatively stable baseline of life satisfaction following both positive and negative changes in their financial circumstances. The lifestyle upgrade your brain believes will feel significantly better than your current life will. Within months, feel essentially the same. Your baseline recalibrates. The brain doesn't measure your life against an absolute standard. It measures it against whatever you've recently experienced, which means the larger apartment, the newer car, the more expensive version of the thing you already own. These raise the baseline you're measuring against, not the satisfaction you experience above it. Your brain doesn't reward you for having more. It rewards you for having more than it expected, and it updates its expectations quickly. People who've genuinely internalized this describe something that's difficult to communicate from the outside, a quieting of the financial restlessness that used to run in the background, the persistent ambient sense that things would feel better once some threshold was crossed. Not because they have more, because they stopped expecting more to feel different. And that shift isn't resignation. It isn't settling. It's one of the more practically useful psychological recalibrations available to someone who wants to build lasting wealth without spending their life chasing a feeling they can never quite catch. The honest acknowledgement, this can tip into a kind of joyless minimalism if taken past its useful limit. The goal isn't to want nothing, it's to stop mistaking the anticipation of having more for reliable evidence that having more will actually satisfy. Those are different things. One of them is neurochemistry, the other is life. Now step back and look at what all 10 of these habits share. Not one of them asks you to become a different kind of person. Not one of them requires you to override your instincts through force of character. They work because they change the architecture around your instincts, so that the default behavior, the automatic unconsidered one, happens to be the wealth-building one. That's the actual insight underneath all of this. Not that financially successful people are more disciplined, that they've built environments where discipline isn't the deciding variable. But the research also shows something that deserves honest acknowledgement rather than a footnote. These habits come with real psychological costs. The person who automates savings aggressively can lose the emotional feedback of watching money grow, which is its own form of motivation. The person who tracks spending without self-compassion can drift into financial shame that produces the avoidance it was meant to prevent. The person who keeps their wins private can quietly lose the social dimension of shared progress. The person who fully internalizes hedonic adaptation can find it genuinely difficult to enjoy what they've actually built. These aren't rare edge cases, they're patterns that show up consistently in the research on high savers, and they're worth naming directly. And if you watch this entire list and recognized almost none of it in yourself, if your brain naturally discounts the future heavily, if saving has always felt abstract, if the present moment is simply where you live most fully, you're not broken. You're not undisciplined. You're not failing at something other people find easy. You're working with different neurology shaped by different experiences, operating with a different set of values about what life is actually for. Research on well-being consistently finds that present orientation is associated with stronger social relationships, more immediate enjoyment, and lower anxiety about outcomes that haven't arrived yet. Those are real goods. They don't get enough credit in conversations about money. The research on what actually predicts long-term financial accumulation, behavioral automation, system design, the reduction of active decision-making, suggests that financial success is less a character achievement than an architectural one. You're not building a better version of yourself, you're building a better set of defaults. And that distinction changes everything about how you approach the gap between where you are and where you want to be. Which means the goal isn't to adopt all 10 of these habits at once and turn your financial life inside out. It's to find the one or two that cost you the least. The ones that fit your actual life without requiring you to perform a personality you don't have, and install them quietly, let them run, check back in 6 months. Boring compounds. That's the whole point. Not because boring is virtuous or because deprivation is a value, but because boring runs without you. It accumulates while you're doing everything else, while you're living, while you're spending in the category that's fully allowed, while you're tolerating the boredom that used to trigger a purchase, while you're watching what you already have grow in the background, quietly, without drama, without a single post about it. If this changed how you're thinking about the habits that actually build wealth, drop a comment and tell me which one surprised you most. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because this channel exists for one reason: to help you understand why your brain does what it does with money, not to make you feel behind, but to make you feel seen. This channel is created for educational and informational purposes only. It is not intended to replace professional psychological, medical, financial, or therapeutic advice. Always consult with a professional.